The janitor's daughter thinks she belongs in this boardroom? The laughter rolled across the polished conference table before anyone even looked up from their tablets. It wasn't loud enough to shake the glass walls surrounding the executive floor, but it was sharp enough to stop 19-year-old Naomi Carter in her tracks. She stood quietly beside the entrance, wearing a simple navy sweater, worn sneakers, and a visitor badge that hung slightly crooked around her neck. In one hand, she carried an aging laptop with a cracked corner, while the other rested nervously against the strap of her backpack. The room smelled of fresh coffee, expensive leather, and polished oak, the unmistakable scent of a place where billion-dollar decisions were made before lunch. At the far end of the table stood Richard Whitmore, the celebrated CEO of Whitmore Dynamics, a man whose name appeared regularly on magazine covers beside words like visionary and industry titan. His tailored charcoal suit looked untouched by the long morning, and the silver cufflinks caught the sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. He barely glanced at Naomi before letting out a dismissive smile. "Security must be getting careless," he said, his voice calm enough to sound polite, yet cold enough to freeze every eye in the room. "I thought today was our quarterly board meeting, not family visiting day." A few executives exchanged uneasy smiles. Others laughed openly, eager to follow the tone set by the most powerful person in the building. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a second. She had heard comments like that before. She knew what people saw first. A young black woman, the daughter of the building's janitor. Someone who clearly didn't belong among custom suits and polished resumes. Before she could respond, the massive presentation screen flickered once, then twice. The carefully prepared opening slide disappeared without warning, replaced by a blank black display. An awkward silence drifted through the room. One of the IT specialists hurried toward the equipment rack, tapping keys with increasing urgency. Another executive refreshed files on his tablet. Nothing happened. The screen remained dark. Richard's confident smile faded almost imperceptibly. "Fix it," he said without raising his voice. "We're already behind schedule." The chief strategy officer leaned toward the laptop connected to the projector. "The presentation file is corrupted." Another technician shook his head. "Not just the file. The backup server isn't responding either." Around the long table, whispers began replacing laughter. The board members had investors arriving in less than 20 minutes. Today's presentation would determine whether the company moved forward with the largest expansion in its history. Outside the glass walls, assistants hurried through the hallway carrying folders and coffee cups, unaware that the meeting at the heart of the company had quietly come to a standstill. Naomi watched the frozen screen, then glanced toward the stack of printed financial summaries resting near the projector. Something didn't feel right. She recognized several of the charts from reports she had studied weeks earlier while waiting for her father to finish his evening shift. Even from across the room, one number immediately caught her attention. It wasn't simply outdated. It was dangerously wrong. Her heartbeat quickened, but her face remained composed. The laughter had stopped. Now the room held only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant echo of footsteps outside the boardroom doors, as if the building itself had paused, waiting to see who would speak first. The silence inside the boardroom stretched longer than anyone expected, but Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, saying nothing. She had learned years ago that silence often revealed more than words ever could. While executives exchanged worried looks around the conference table, her thoughts drifted back to the quiet evenings that had shaped her long before she ever stepped onto the executive floor. Every weekday after community college classes ended, she rode 2 city buses across Chicago to Whitmore Dynamics. By 5:30 every afternoon, the lobby was beginning to empty, and the marble floors reflected the fading sunlight pouring through the towering windows. That was when her father, David Carter, clocked in for another overnight shift. For 18 years, he had cleaned the same hallways, emptied the same office trash bins, polished the same conference tables, and greeted every employee with the same gentle smile, whether they returned it or not. David often joked that he probably knew every floor tile in the building better than the architects who designed it. Naomi would wait for him in the employee lounge until security allowed her upstairs to the quiet corners where no meetings were taking place. While her father carefully pushed his cleaning cart through empty corridors, she opened her old laptop and studied business strategy, financial reports, and public earnings statements using the building's wireless internet. Sometimes she read until midnight while the soft sound of vacuum cleaners echoed through distant hallways. Sometimes she watched recordings of shareholder meetings, pausing every few minutes to write notes in a spiral notebook already filled with tiny handwriting. She did not dream about becoming famous. She simply wanted to understand how great companies made difficult decisions. David never interrupted her studies. Instead, every night before starting another hallway, he placed a fresh bottle of water beside her laptop and smiled. "Do every job with pride," he always reminded her. "Whether you are cleaning the floor or leading the meeting, people remember the care you put into your work." Naomi carried those words with her far more carefully than any textbook. On weekends, while many of her classmates relaxed or went shopping, she downloaded public filings from the Securities and Exchange Commission, compared quarterly reports, and practiced building presentations from real corporate data. She entered student business competitions whenever she could, often borrowing library computers because her own laptop struggled to keep up with larger files. She never complained when classmates arrived with expensive tablets and new software. She simply worked longer. Last month, she had even downloaded Whitmore Dynamics' publicly available investor reports, fascinated by the company's rapid expansion into renewable manufacturing. The numbers impressed her, but several assumptions buried inside the forecasts left questions she could not ignore. She recalculated everything twice, then a third time, convinced something was missing. She saved her notes in a presentation of her own, not because anyone would ever ask to see it, but because solving difficult problems had become second nature. Back inside the boardroom, her eyes returned to the printed reports resting near the disabled projector. The figures she had recognized were the very same ones she had questioned late one evening while her father quietly polished the conference table, now surrounded by anxious executives. She inhaled slowly. Across the room, David had just entered through the service hallway with his cleaning cart, unaware that every person at the table was staring at the blank screen instead of the agenda. He noticed Naomi standing near the doorway and offered the smallest reassuring smile before stopping beside the wall, hoping not to interrupt the meeting. Neither father nor daughter realized that within the next few minutes, everything they had quietly built over 18 years inside these walls was about to be tested. Richard Whitmore slowly placed both hands on the edge of the conference table, his reflection shimmering across the glossy black surface beneath the ceiling lights. He disliked surprises, and he disliked delays even more. For nearly 2 decades, he had built Whitmore Dynamics into one of the fastest-growing manufacturing companies in America, acquiring smaller competitors, expanding into clean energy, and convincing investors that every move was carefully calculated years before anyone else recognized the opportunity. Business magazines praised his confidence. Television interviews celebrated his leadership. Inside the company, however, many employees knew another side of him. Richard respected results, but he often measured people before he measured their ideas. Expensive suits inspired confidence. Prestigious universities earned immediate attention. Job titles opened doors long before conversations ever began. Those who cleaned offices, served coffee, or worked behind the scenes rarely existed in his world beyond the tasks they performed. Around the conference table sat 12 board members whose decisions could move billions of dollars in a single afternoon. Eleanor Brooks, the board chair, adjusted her reading glasses while quietly reviewing the printed agenda. She had spent 30 years navigating corporate leadership and understood that the strongest executives often revealed themselves during unexpected setbacks rather than perfect presentations. Beside her, Chief Financial Officer Daniel Hayes repeatedly refreshed the financial dashboard on his tablet, hoping the missing files would somehow reappear. Across the table, investors whispered to one another, careful not to let anxiety show on their faces. Every passing minute increased the pressure. Outside the glass walls, executive assistants gathered near the hallway windows, pretending to organize documents while stealing nervous glances toward the silent boardroom. Everyone knew today's proposal mattered. The company planned to approve a nationwide expansion involving 6 new manufacturing facilities across 3 states, thousands of new jobs, and hundreds of millions of dollars in financing. If approved, the project would become the largest investment Whitmore Dynamics had ever attempted. If delayed, months of negotiations could unravel before the market opened the following morning. Richard looked toward the technology team with growing impatience. Tell me we have another backup. One technician swallowed before answering. We do, sir, but it was synchronized with the same server overnight. The corruption spread to every copy. Another specialist quietly added. Restoring everything could take several hours. Several board members leaned back with visible disappointment. One investor checked his watch. Another rubbed his forehead while calculating how the delay might affect the afternoon trading session. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose. We are not postponing this meeting because of a software failure. His voice remained controlled, but the confidence that usually filled the room now sounded strained. Eleanor folded her hands together without speaking. Immediately, she watched the faces around the table, noticing something Richard had missed. Near the doorway, Naomi Carter was not looking at the blank screen anymore. She was studying the printed reports spread across the table with unusual concentration, almost as though she had seen them before. Eleanor followed her gaze, then noticed Naomi's old laptop tucked beneath her arm. It was not the device of someone expecting to sit quietly in a waiting area. It looked well used, covered with handwritten labels and small notes tucked between the keyboard and the protective case. David Carter remained beside his cleaning cart near the wall, standing respectfully with lowered eyes. Wishing only for the meeting to continue so he could finish polishing the executive hallway. Richard finally noticed Naomi again and gave a brief, dismissive glance before turning back toward the board. He had already decided she was simply waiting for her father. Eleanor, however, had begun wondering something entirely different. She could not explain why, but the calm expression on the young woman's face looked nothing like someone overwhelmed by the most important room in the building. It looked like someone quietly deciding whether it was finally time to speak. Naomi took one careful step forward before doubt could catch up with her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady enough to rise above the uneasy silence without sounding confrontational. Every conversation stopped. Even the technicians paused over the disconnected cables. Richard Whitmore turned slowly, clearly surprised that the quiet young woman near the entrance had spoken at all. "What is it?" he asked, impatience sharpening every word. Naomi kept her posture relaxed. "I think the presentation is not the biggest problem." Several eyebrows lifted around the table. Daniel Hayes looked up from his tablet. Eleanor Brooks watched without interrupting. Richard folded his arms. "And how would you know that?" Naomi glanced toward the stack of printed financial reports lying beside the empty projector screen. "Because the revenue assumptions in the expansion model are based on outdated supplier costs. Even if the slides worked, the recommendation would still expose the company to unnecessary risk." The room became perfectly still. One executive let out a quiet laugh. Another leaned toward his neighbor and whispered, "She has been reading papers left in the lobby." A few smiles returned around the table, though this time they carried uncertainty rather than confidence. Richard looked almost amused. "Young lady, those reports were prepared by analysts with decades of experience." Naomi nodded respectfully. "I believe they worked very hard. I only think one assumption changed after the commodity market shifted 6 weeks ago." Daniel instinctively pulled the printed report closer and scanned the supply cost table. His eyes narrowed. Eleanor noticed the movement immediately. Richard did not. "Security," Richard said calmly, looking toward the hallway. "Please help our guests back to the waiting area. We have serious business to finish." David Carter immediately stepped away from his cleaning cart. "Sir," he said quietly, his cap already in his hands, "I apologize if my daughter interrupted. She only loves studying business. She did not mean any disrespect." Naomi looked at her father, her heart tightening far more than it had when the room laughed at her. He had spent 18 years protecting his job with humility and quiet dignity. She did not want him embarrassed because of her. "Dad," she said softly, "it is okay." Richard glanced briefly toward David before returning his attention to the board. "Mr. Carter, this has nothing to do with you. Please take your daughter downstairs." Before David could answer, Eleanor Brooks spoke for the first time since the meeting had stalled. "One moment." Her voice was not loud, but every head turned toward her immediately. She removed her glasses and looked directly at Naomi. "You said the supplier assumptions changed 6 weeks ago. Tell me exactly what changed." Naomi hesitated for only a heartbeat. The lithium processing contract signed in Nevada increased transportation costs by almost 12% after the revised rail regulations took effect. Those projections no longer match the numbers in your printed reports. If the company approves this expansion using those assumptions, the projected operating margin will appear stronger than reality. Daniel's fingers moved rapidly across his calculator. He entered several figures, stopped, erased them, and entered them again. The color slowly drained from his face. Richard noticed Daniel's expression and frowned. Is she correct? Daniel did not answer immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Naomi carefully set her old laptop on the edge of the conference table. The worn plastic case looked strangely out of place beside polished leather portfolios and expensive computers. She looked toward Eleanor rather than Richard. I already built an updated presentation using the public reports and the revised market data. It is not perfect, but it reflects the current numbers. Eleanor studied her for another long moment before asking the question that made every person in the room hold their breath. Miss Carter, she said calmly, if we give you 5 minutes, can you prove it? Richard Whitmore let out a slow breath that sounded more like disbelief than patience. He looked around the table, expecting someone to dismiss the conversation for him, but no one spoke. Daniel Hayes was still staring at the calculator in front of him, repeating the same figures with increasingly careful movements. Eleanor Brooks remained calm, her attention fixed entirely on Naomi. Richard finally shook his head. Absolutely not, he said. This meeting determines the future of a company worth billions of dollars. We are not handing the floor to someone whose qualifications begin with waiting for her father to finish cleaning offices. The words landed heavily across the room. Several executives lowered their eyes, uncomfortable with the remark, but unwilling to challenge the chief executive. Naomi felt the sting of the comment, yet her expression remained composed. She had promised herself years earlier that she would never allow another person's opinion to decide her worth. David Carter stepped forward again, his weathered hands folded together in front of him. Sir, if my daughter crossed a line, I sincerely apologize. She respects this company very much. Please do not think she meant to disrupt your meeting. Richard nodded politely toward David, but his voice remained firm. Mr. Carter, you have always done your work well. This is not about your dedication, but there is a difference between maintaining this building and directing its future. David accepted the words with quiet dignity, though Naomi noticed the disappointment hidden behind his gentle smile. It hurt her far more than the laughter had. Every late night her father had spent polishing conference tables. Every early morning he had left home before sunrise. Every encouraging word he had spoken while believing in her dreams suddenly seemed to stand silently beside him. Naomi looked toward Eleanor. I understand if the answer is no, she said calmly. But if the numbers are incorrect, delaying 5 minutes could save much more than it costs. Richard answered before anyone else could. Confidence is admirable. Experience is something else entirely. One board member quietly cleared his throat. Another adjusted the printed reports in front of him, avoiding eye contact with both Richard and Naomi. Daniel finally looked up from his calculations. Richard, he said carefully, the transportation adjustment she mentioned does exist. Richard turned toward him. How significant? Daniel hesitated. Large enough that I cannot dismiss it without reviewing the model. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. The certainty that had surrounded the chief executive all morning began to loosen. Eleanor slowly stood from her chair. The soft movement immediately drew every eye toward her. She walked to the head of the conference table, resting one hand lightly against the polished wood. Sunlight reflected across the surface, illuminating the printed reports scattered before the board members. This company was built on evidence, she said evenly, not on assumptions about who is allowed to present it. Richard remained silent. Eleanor looked directly at Naomi. You said you prepared your own analysis. Naomi nodded once. Yes, ma'am. And you believe it reflects today's market more accurately than the material prepared for this meeting? Yes, ma'am. Eleanor glanced around the table. Then I see only 2 possibilities. Either we spend 5 minutes proving she is mistaken, or we spend years regretting that we never listened. No one objected. Even the executives who had laughed earlier now watched Naomi with cautious curiosity instead of amusement. David quietly stepped back beside his cleaning cart, his fingers still resting on the worn handle. His heart raced, But he said nothing. He had spent 18 years teaching his daughter that respect could never be demanded, only earned through character. Now, standing beneath the same lights he had cleaned countless nights before, he silently prayed that the opportunity she had worked for in empty hallways was finally about to arrive. Naomi placed her old laptop on the conference table with both hands, almost gently, as though she understood that confidence never needed dramatic gestures. The scratched plastic cover reflected a faint line of sunlight spilling through the towering windows behind the board. Someone quietly connected an adapter to the projector. The black screen flickered once, then came alive with a clean white title slide that simply read, "Updated Expansion Risk Assessment." No flashy graphics. No company logo. Just clear words against a bright background. Naomi wrapped one hand around the presentation remote that an assistant silently handed her. It felt cool against her fingertips. She took one slow breath, then another, allowing the silence to settle before speaking. Around the room, expensive watches stopped tapping against polished wood. Coffee cups remained untouched. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than the people seated around the table. Richard Whitmore leaned back in his chair with folded arms, determined not to reveal either curiosity or concern. Eleanor Brooks rested her hands together, watching Naomi with patient attention instead of expectation. Daniel Hayes positioned his calculator beside the printed reports, ready to verify every number he heard. Near the wall, David Carter stood beside his cleaning cart exactly where he had remained for the last several minutes. The familiar blue uniform he had worn for years suddenly looked almost symbolic against the elegant conference room, a quiet reminder that dignity could exist long before recognition ever arrived. Naomi looked briefly toward her father. He answered with nothing more than a small nod, the same encouraging nod he had given her before every school competition, every scholarship interview, and every difficult exam. She smiled almost imperceptibly before facing the board once more. "Thank you for giving me 5 minutes," she said. "Whether you agree with my conclusions or not, I appreciate the opportunity to present evidence instead of assumptions." No one interrupted. The opening sentence carried neither arrogance nor apology. It simply invited people to listen. Naomi pressed the remote. The first chart appeared, comparing transportation costs over the previous 12 months. Clean blue lines climbed steadily before turning sharply upward 6 weeks earlier. She did not rush to explain them. Instead, she allowed everyone to absorb the image before speaking again. "Every projection depends on the quality of the assumptions beneath it," she said calmly. "When one assumption changes, every forecast connected to it deserves another look." Daniel immediately recognized the public market data displayed along the bottom of the slide. It matched the latest regulatory updates exactly. One investor leaned forward without realizing he had done so. Another quietly reached for a pen instead of his coffee. Richard remained expressionless, but his eyes no longer drifted toward the door. They stayed fixed on the screen. Outside the glass walls, a handful of assistants slowed their steps, noticing the unusual stillness inside the boardroom. Through the windows, afternoon sunlight reflected across neighboring skyscrapers, filling the conference room with a warm golden glow that softened the sharp edges of polished steel and dark wood. Naomi stood comfortably within that light, speaking with the quiet confidence of someone who had prepared long before anyone imagined she would ever have the chance. At that moment, if Naomi's courage reminds you that talent can grow in the most unexpected places, take a moment to like this story, share where you are watching from, and continue this journey with us, because sometimes the smallest opportunity becomes the beginning of the greatest transformation. She pressed the remote once more, and the next slide appeared as every pair of eyes in the room followed her without distraction. Naomi clicked to the next slide, and the room that had once greeted her with quiet laughter now leaned forward in complete silence. A detailed comparison filled the screen, showing supplier contracts, transportation expenses, regulatory updates, and projected operating margins side by side. Every figure included its public source, every assumption was documented, and every calculation could be traced from beginning to end. She moved through the information without rushing, speaking with the calm rhythm of someone explaining a truth rather than trying to win an argument. "The expansion itself is not the problem," she said. "It is the timing and the pricing model. If the company approves this version today, the first year will appear profitable on paper, but the revised transportation costs will reduce operating margins enough to trigger covenant concerns with several lending partners. Daniel Hayes immediately opened another spreadsheet on his tablet. His fingers moved rapidly across the screen as he rebuilt the calculations using Naomi's updated assumptions. The seconds felt unusually long. One board member quietly removed his glasses to study the charts more carefully. Another flipped through the printed reports, comparing each page with the presentation now displayed before them. Richard Whitmore remained perfectly still, but the confidence that had filled his posture earlier that morning had slowly given way to careful observation. Naomi pressed the remote again. The next slide displayed 3 simple recommendations instead of dozens of complicated charts. Delay construction on one facility by 90 days. Renegotiate 2 supplier agreements before signing financing documents, and redirect a portion of the capital budget toward regional distribution improvements that would reduce long-term shipping costs. These adjustments do not cancel the expansion, Naomi explained. They protect it. Eleanor Brooks looked toward Daniel. Can you verify the numbers? Daniel did not answer immediately. He recalculated every major assumption one final time before setting his tablet on the table. He slowly nodded. Every primary calculation checks out. In fact, the revised operating margin is more realistic than the version we prepared. A quiet murmur spread around the room. One investor who had remained skeptical since the beginning leaned back in his chair and smiled with visible relief. Another board member quietly applauded once. The sound echoed softly through the room before several others joined in. Within moments, the entire boardroom filled with steady applause that carried none of the politeness often heard after executive presentations. This applause came from genuine respect. Naomi stood motionless for a moment, almost surprised by the sound herself. She had imagined many endings while practicing alone in empty hallways late at night, but she had never imagined this one. Richard looked around the room and realized that every board member's attention had shifted away from him and toward the young woman standing beside the projector. For perhaps the first time in years, he understood what it felt like to lose authority without anyone raising their voice. Eleanor smiled warmly before addressing the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we have just witnessed something remarkable. We did not discover a problem today. We discovered a person who refused to ignore one. David Carter quietly lowered his head as emotion filled his eyes. He remembered the countless evenings Naomi had waited patiently while he finished waxing these same floors, studying beneath the soft hallway lights long after most employees had gone home. Every sacrifice, every bus ride, every late night, every encouraging conversation suddenly seemed to gather into this single unforgettable moment. Naomi looked toward her father before speaking one final time. I only hoped someone would listen to the data, she said gently. The opportunity to stand here was more than I ever expected. No one laughed this time. Instead, the boardroom that had once questioned whether she belonged now rose to its feet, honoring her with a standing ovation that even Richard Whitmore could not ignore. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling it left behind lingered in the room like warm sunlight after a passing storm. Naomi gently closed her laptop, her hands steady despite everything that had just happened. She had not walked into the boardroom hoping to prove anyone wrong. She had simply wanted the company her father had faithfully served for nearly 2 decades to avoid making a costly mistake. Eleanor Brooks looked around the table before speaking with quiet conviction. I move that we suspend the current proposal and adopt the revised framework presented by Ms. Carter for immediate review. One by one, the board members raised their hands. The motion passed without a single vote against it. Daniel Hayes smiled as he gathered the outdated reports into a neat stack. This adjustment will save the company millions of dollars during the first phase alone, he admitted. More importantly, it gives us a strategy that can actually withstand changing market conditions. Richard Whitmore remained seated for several long seconds. His eyes rested on the polished conference table where only minutes earlier he had dismissed Naomi before she spoke a single sentence. The room waited. No one rushed him. Finally, he stood. The confidence that had always surrounded him was still there, but now it was accompanied by something far less common in corporate boardrooms. Humility. He walked slowly toward Naomi until only a few feet separated them. Every executive watched in complete silence. Richard took a measured breath before speaking. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice noticeably softer than before. "Today I judged you before I listened to you. I looked at your circumstances instead of your preparation. That was my mistake." Naomi met his eyes without anger. She simply listened. Richard then turned toward David Carter, who still stood quietly beside the cleaning cart that had accompanied him through thousands of ordinary workdays. "Mr. Carter," Richard continued, "I owe you an apology as well. For years I noticed spotless floors, polished glass, and conference rooms, prepared before every meeting, but I never truly noticed the man doing the work. Your dedication helped build the environment where this company succeeds every single day." David lowered his eyes with quiet grace. "I have always believed every job deserves respect, sir," he answered gently. Richard nodded. "You were right. I should have believed that sooner." Eleanor smiled as she watched the exchange unfold. It was the kind of leadership lesson no seminar could teach. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and removed a business card before placing it carefully on the conference table beside Naomi's laptop. "When you finish college," he said, "I would like you to consider joining Whitmore Dynamics as part of our strategic planning team. Not because of what happened today alone, but because talent like yours belongs wherever important decisions are made." Naomi looked briefly toward her father before answering. His eyes glistened beneath the bright conference lights, yet his familiar, gentle smile had never looked prouder. She turned back toward Richard. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I appreciate your offer. But what matters most to me is not where I work. It is knowing that every person who walks into a room has the chance to be heard before they are judged." Richard slowly nodded, understanding the weight of her words. If this moment reminded you that kindness, preparation, and quiet courage can change even the strongest hearts, take a moment to like this story, share where you are watching from, and remember that real leadership always begins by recognizing the value in others. No one spoke for several seconds afterward. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. 3 months later, the first rays of an autumn sunrise stretched across the glass facade of Whitmore Dynamics, turning the entire headquarters into a mirror of gold and pale blue. Employees streamed through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups, laptops, and the familiar urgency of another busy morning. But something inside the building had quietly changed. Near the executive elevators, a framed photograph from the recent shareholder meeting now hung beside several company awards. It captured an ordinary moment rather than a staged celebration. Naomi Carter stood beside a presentation screen with a modest smile, while the board members applauded around her. Beneath the photograph, a simple brass plaque read, "Integrity builds stronger futures." People paused to look at it almost every day. On the 20th floor, a new office overlooked the Chicago skyline. The nameplate outside the door caught the morning light with understated elegance. Naomi Carter, Director of Strategic Innovation. She paused for a brief moment before entering, running her fingers lightly across the engraved letters as if reminding herself that titles were never the destination, only another opportunity to serve well. Her desk remained surprisingly simple. A notebook, a family photograph, several market reports, and the same old laptop with its cracked corner rested beside a newer company computer. She had chosen to keep the worn laptop because it reminded her where preparation had truly begun. Downstairs, David Carter quietly guided his cleaning cart through the lobby, just as he had done for nearly 18 years. The polished marble reflected the ceiling lights so clearly that visitors often complimented the building before noticing the man responsible for its shine. He never sought recognition. He simply continued working with the same careful attention that had defined every shift. As he reached the main reception area, Richard Whitmore walked through the entrance carrying a leather briefcase instead of rushing directly toward the elevators. He noticed David immediately. This time he did not continue walking. Instead, he approached with a warm smile and extended his hand. "Good morning, David," he said. "Thank you for everything you do." Several employees nearby looked up with quiet surprise. David accepted the handshake with the same gentle humility he had always carried. "Good morning, Richard. I hope you have a wonderful day." Richard nodded before entering the elevator, but not before holding the doors open for David to step inside first. Neither man mentioned the board meeting that had changed so much between them. They no longer needed to. Respect. had become part of their daily routine instead of an exceptional moment. Later that afternoon, Naomi walked through the same executive hallway where she had once waited alone while her father finished another overnight shift. The floors still gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. The quiet hum of the ventilation system echoed softly through the corridor. Everything looked almost exactly the same, yet nothing truly was. She found her father finishing the final section of polished stone near the boardroom entrance. Without saying a word, she took a clean microfiber cloth from the top of his cart and helped him wipe the last stretch of the handrail they had both passed countless times over the years. David smiled, and together they admired the sunlight reflecting across the spotless floor. There was no audience, no applause, no cameras, and no speeches. Only a father, a daughter, and the peaceful silence that follows when kindness proves stronger than judgment. Outside, the city continued moving without pause, but inside those quiet hallways, justice had left no sound at all, only a light that reflected a little farther than before.